Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh thought he could embarrass Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett during a heated judicial oversight hearing. The lifetime-appointed judge made a comment that sent shockwaves through the packed committee room. But what Jasmine Crockett said next didn't just silence Kavanaugh. It exposed something that could shake the very foundation of the Supreme Court. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what happens when preparation meets arrogance in the halls of power. The marble walls of the Senate Judiciary Committee room had witnessed many battles, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold on this crisp October morning. Justice Brett Kavanaugh sat at the witness table, his black robe replaced by a sharp navy suit, confident in his position as one of 9 lifetime appointees to the highest court in the land. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas adjusted her microphone, her bright blazer a stark contrast to the sea of dark suits surrounding her. What started as routine judicial oversight was about to become a masterclass in political warfare. Kavanaugh, emboldened by years of conservative victories and protected by lifetime tenure, was about to learn that underestimating a prepared opponent, especially one with nothing to lose, could be the biggest mistake of his career. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, you need to know who these two political powerhouses really are and why this confrontation mattered far beyond the marble halls of Congress. Brett Kavanaugh didn't just stumble into power. He was groomed for it. Yale Law School graduate, decades in conservative legal circles, and a Supreme Court justice since 2018 despite one of the most controversial confirmation battles in American history. At 59, Kavanaugh represented everything the establishment protected: lifetime tenure, unlimited power, and zero accountability to voters. His confirmation had been a nightmare of allegations and heated exchanges, but he survived. More importantly, he learned that with enough political backing, even the most serious challenges could be weathered. Since joining the court, Kavanaugh had been part of landmark conservative victories, overturning Roe v. Wade, limiting voting rights protections, and expanding corporate power. He was untouchable, or so he thought. The justice had developed a reputation for sharp questioning during oral arguments, often interrupting lawyers mid-sentence with a condescending tone that legal scholars noted but never challenged. After all, who was going to check a Supreme Court justice? His colleagues? The media? Congress? None had proven effective at holding the court accountable. On the other side of the room sat someone who couldn't have been more different. Jasmine Crockett, 43, had climbed from a working-class family in St. Louis to become one of the most feared questioners in Congress. A former civil rights attorney and Texas state legislator, she built her career defending the powerless against the powerful. Crockett wasn't just another politician. She was a lawyer who knew how to dissect arguments, expose weaknesses, and deliver knockout blows with surgical precision. Her questioning style had already made headlines when she dismantled corporate executives and cabinet officials with devastating effectiveness. Unlike Kavanaugh, she faced voters every 2 years and had earned their trust by delivering results, not hiding behind lifetime appointments. More importantly, Crockett had spent months preparing for this moment. While other committee members focused on broad policy questions, she'd been digging into something specific, something that could change everything about how Americans viewed the Supreme Court integrity. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. This was about accountability in American democracy. The Supreme Court had become increasingly powerful and increasingly conservative, making decisions that affected every American while answering to no one. Recent polls showed public trust in the court at historic lows, especially after revelations about justices accepting expensive gifts and refusing to recuse themselves from cases involving their financial interests. For Kavanaugh, this hearing was supposed to be routine: a few hours of predictable questions, deflective answers, and then back to the marble palace where his word was law. For Crockett, this was an opportunity to do what no one else had been able to accomplish: hold a Supreme Court justice truly accountable for their actions. The room was packed with reporters, law students, and political observers who sensed something big was brewing. C-SPAN cameras captured every angle as Chairman Dick Durbin called the hearing to order. What none of them knew was that Crockett had been awake until 3 a.m. the night before, reviewing documents that could expose a pattern of behavior that went far beyond partisan politics. The first 2 hours of the hearing followed the expected script. Republican senators lobbed softball questions about judicial philosophy, while Democrats pressed on ethics and transparency. Kavanaugh deflected with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years in Washington's political machinery. Senator Chuck Grassley started with friendly questions about court procedures, giving Kavanaugh an easy warm-up. Justice Kavanaugh, could you explain to the American people how the Supreme Court maintains its independence? Kavanaugh leaned into his microphone, voice steady and confident. Senator, the court's independence is fundamental to our constitutional system. We make decisions based on law and precedent, not political pressure or popular opinion. That's why we have lifetime tenure, to ensure we can make difficult decisions without fear of retribution. Murmurs of approval came from the Republican side of the room. This was familiar territory, the kind of high-minded constitutional talk that usually ended hearings without incident. When questioning moved to the Democratic side, the tone shifted. Senator Elizabeth Warren pressed on ethics rules, asking pointed questions about financial disclosures and gift reporting. Kavanaugh's answers became shorter, more defensive. Justice Kavanaugh, Warren began, her voice carrying prosecutorial edge that had made her famous. Don't you think the American people deserve to know when Supreme Court justices receive substantial gifts from individuals with business before the court? Kavanaugh's jaw tightened slightly. Senator, the court has clear ethics guidelines, and all justices follow applicable disclosure requirements. We maintain the highest standards of judicial conduct. That's not what I asked. Warren shot back. I asked about substantial gifts. Are you saying you've never received gifts that might influence your decisions? I resent the implication, Kavanaugh replied, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before. The court's integrity is beyond reproach, and questions like yours undermine public confidence in our judicial system. The room's energy shifted. Reporters leaned forward, sensing the civility was beginning to crack. When Chairman Durbin recognized Representative Crockett for her questioning time, a hush fell over the room. Word spread that the Texas Congresswoman had something special planned, though no one knew exactly what. Crockett looked down at her notes, then directly at Kavanaugh. Justice Kavanaugh, thank you for being here today. I want to start with a simple question about judicial recusal. Kavanaugh straightened in his chair, probably expecting another standard question about when judges should step aside from cases. Of course, Congresswoman. Under federal law, a judge must recuse themselves when their impartiality might reasonably be questioned, correct? That's correct, Kavanaugh replied, relaxing slightly. This seemed like basic legal doctrine. And that includes situations where a judge has a financial interest in the outcome of a case? Obviously, yes. What about when a judge's family members have financial interests that could be affected by a case? Kavanaugh hesitated for just a moment, the first crack in his armor. The standards for family relationships are more complex. Each situation must be evaluated on its own merits. Crockett nodded, making a note. More complex. I see. What about when a judge's spouse receives substantial payments from organizations that regularly appear before the court? The room went dead silent. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Everyone knew Crockett was building towards something specific, and Kavanaugh's face showed he was beginning to realize he might be walking into a trap. Congresswoman, Kavanaugh said carefully, without discussing specific cases or circumstances, I can say that all justices are aware of their ethical obligations and take them seriously. That's interesting, Crockett replied, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made everyone lean forward. Because I have some specific circumstances I'd like to discuss with you. Crockett reached for a folder on the table beside her. The simple gesture sent a ripple of tension through the room. Reporters raised their phones. Committee members shifted in their seats. And Kavanaugh's confident demeanor began to show the first signs of strain. Justice Kavanaugh, are you familiar with the case of Morrison Industries versus Environmental Protection Agency, which came before the Supreme Court last term? Kavanaugh's eyes narrowed. I'm familiar with many cases that come before the court. This particular case involved a challenge to environmental regulations that would have cost certain industries billions of dollars. The court ruled 6-3 in favor of the corporations, with you writing the majority opinion. Do you recall that case now? I recall writing several majority opinions last term, Kavanaugh replied, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Crockett opened her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Let me refresh your memory. Your opinion in that case overturned EPA regulations that would have required certain chemical companies to install expensive pollution controls. The ruling saved these companies an estimated $12 billion in compliance costs. If that's accurate, then yes, but I decided that case based on legal precedent and constitutional principles, not financial considerations. Of course, Crockett said, her tone suggesting she didn't believe a word of it. Legal precedent. Constitutional principles. That's what you always say, isn't it? Kavanaugh's face flushed slightly. Congresswoman, I don't appreciate the implication. Oh, I haven't made any implications yet, Crockett interrupted smoothly. But since you brought up, let me ask you this. Did you know that your wife actually received a $250,000 consulting payment from Heritage Environmental Solutions just 2 months before oral arguments in the Morrison case? The room exploded. The reaction was immediate and electric. Committee members started talking over each other. Reporters began furiously typing, and the C-SPAN cameras captured Kavanaugh's face as it went from flush to pale in a matter of seconds. That's completely inappropriate, Kavanaugh sputtered, his composure finally cracking. My wife's professional activities are separate from my judicial duties, and your suggestion otherwise is offensive and baseless. But Crockett wasn't finished. She pulled out a second document, her movements deliberate and theatrical. Baseless? Justice Kavanaugh, Heritage Environmental Solutions is a subsidiary of Morrison Industries, the exact company that benefited from your ruling. Your wife received $250,000 from the winning party just weeks before you decided their case in their favor. I had no knowledge of my wife's consulting arrangements. Kavanaugh shot back, but his voice was shaking now. Even if what you're suggesting were true, which I dispute, spousal employment doesn't create a conflict requiring recusal. Crockett leaned forward, her voice cutting through the chaos in the room. No knowledge? Justice Kavanaugh, this payment was deposited into a joint account that you both control. The bank records show your electronic signature authorizing the deposit. The room went completely silent. This wasn't just about ethics anymore. This was about potential perjury, about a Supreme Court justice lying under oath to Congress. Kavanaugh's face had gone from pale to red to an almost purple shade. His hands gripped the edge of the witness table as he struggled to find words. The specifics of our family finances are private matters that have no bearing on my judicial decisions. Private matters? Crockett's voice rose for the first time, cutting through the room like a blade. Justice Kavanaugh, you just sat there and told this committee under oath that you had no knowledge of your wife's consulting arrangements. Now you're saying family finances are private? Which is it? Did you not know, or are you refusing to discuss what you knew? The trap was complete, and everyone in the room could see it. Kavanaugh had been caught in a direct contradiction, under oath, before Congress and the American people. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done yet. What happened next would be replayed on news channels, social media, and in law school classrooms for years to come. It was a moment when lifetime tenure met immovable preparation, when institutional arrogance collided with laser-focused accountability. As the room buzzed with shocked whispers and frantic note-taking, Justice Kavanaugh made a mistake that would define the rest of the hearing. Instead of acknowledging the contradiction or asking for time to review records, he doubled down. His voice took on the condescending tone that had marked his confirmation hearings years earlier. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, emphasizing her title as if it were somehow lesser than his own, with all due respect to your enthusiasm, you seem to be confusing a routine business transaction with some kind of conspiracy theory. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Kavanaugh had just dismissed one of Congress's most skilled questioners as an enthusiastic amateur chasing conspiracy theories. In the packed committee room, you could practically feel the collective intake of breath as observers realized what had just happened. Crockett's expression didn't change, but anyone who knew her could see the slight tightening around her eyes that meant someone had just made a very serious mistake. Conspiracy theory, she repeated slowly, her voice deadly calm. Justice Kavanaugh, Did you just call documented financial records showing a $250,000 payment from a case party to your family a conspiracy theory? I called your interpretation of those records, assuming they even exist, a conspiracy theory. Yes, Kavanaugh replied, is arrogance fully on display now? This is exactly the kind of political theater that undermines respect for our institutions. It was the perfect setup, and Crockett was about to knock it down with devastating precision. Crockett reached into her folder and pulled out not one or two documents, but a thick stack of papers. She held them up so the cameras could see them clearly, then began laying them out on the table in front of her, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Political theater, she said, her voice carrying across the now silent room. Justice Kavanaugh, let me show you what political theater actually looks like. She held up the first document. This is the bank record showing the $250,000 deposit to your joint account on March 15th, 2023. Your signature is right here, authorizing the transfer. The second document. This is the contract between Heritage Environmental Solutions and Ashley Kavanaugh for strategic consulting services. The signature date is March 1st, 2023. The third. This is a Supreme Court's docket showing that Morrison Industries v. EPA was scheduled for oral arguments on April 3rd, 2023, just 3 weeks after your wife signed this contract. The fourth, this is your financial disclosure form from last year, where this payment is notably absent despite federal requirements that justices report spousal income over $200. The fifth, and this, Justice Kavanaugh, is an email thread between Heritage Environmental Solutions and Morrison Industries discussing, quote, ensuring favorable consideration from all relevant decision-makers, unquote, in the EPA case. By now, the room was in complete chaos. Committee members were shouting questions, reporters were live-tweeting, and cameras were flashing continuously. But Crockett's voice cut through all of it as she delivered the final blow. So let me ask you again, Justice Kavanaugh, and remember that you are under oath before Congress and the American people. Are you telling this committee that a $250,000 payment from a case party to your family just weeks before you ruled in their favor is a conspiracy theory? For perhaps the first time in his life, Brett Kavanaugh was completely speechless. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as he stared at the damning documents spread across Crockett's table. The man who had spent his career using words as weapons suddenly had none. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. In the age of social media and viral moments, 30 seconds of a Supreme Court justice sitting speechless before Congress might as well have been eternity. When Kavanaugh finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. Those documents, I would need to review. You would need to review your own signature? Crockett interrupted, her prosecutorial instincts in full display. You would need to review a $250,000 deposit into your own bank account? Justice Kavanaugh, do you often forget about payments of that size? This is ambush. Kavanaugh finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. This is a political hit job designed to undermine the court's legitimacy. No, Justice Kavanaugh, Crockett replied, her voice rising with righteous anger. What undermines the court's legitimacy is when justices take money from case parties and then rule in their favor. What undermines legitimacy is when those same justices lie to Congress about under oath. The room erupted again, but this time Crockett wasn't finished. She stood up, her voice carrying over the chaos with the authority of someone who had just exposed one of the biggest scandals in Supreme Court history. Justice Kavanaugh, you've spent this entire hearing talking about the court's integrity and independence. You've lectured us about judicial ethics and constitutional principles. But these documents show that you personally profited from a case that came before your court, failed to recuse yourself despite an obvious conflict of interest, and then lied to Congress about your knowledge of the payment. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. So here's my final question, and I want a yes or no answer. Do you still believe that questioning your conduct is just a conspiracy theory? Kavanaugh's response was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever seen from a Supreme Court justice. His face went through a series of color changes as he struggled to formulate an answer. His hands shook as he reached for his water glass, nearly knocking it over in the process. You can't. He stammered, then stopped. He looked around the room as if searching for help that wasn't coming. Republican committee members sat in stunned silence, unable to defend the indefensible. Democratic members looked like they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Finally, in a voice that was barely audible, Kavanaugh said, "I invoke my right to end this questioning period and consult with counsel." But Crockett wasn't about to let him escape that easily. "Justice Kavanaugh, you don't have a right to end congressional questioning just because you don't like the questions. You have lifetime tenure, which means lifetime accountability. So I'll ask one more time. Yes or no, do you still think this is a conspiracy theory?" The silence that followed was deafening. Kavanaugh sat there, a Supreme Court justice reduced to speechlessness by a congresswoman with a stack of documents and an unshakable commitment to truth. Finally, Chairman Durbin intervened. "Justice Kavanaugh, the congresswoman has asked you a direct question. Please answer yes or no." Kavanaugh looked up, his eyes meeting Crockett's for the first time since she'd started her questioning. In that moment, everyone in the room could see that he knew it was over. "No," he whispered. "It's not a conspiracy theory." The admission sent shockwaves through the room. A Supreme Court justice had just acknowledged, under oath, that evidence of his corruption was real. But Jasmine Crockett had one final surprise that would make headlines around the world. Within minutes of Kavanaugh's admission, the political and media worlds exploded. Hashtag Kavanaugh corruption began trending on Twitter before the hearing had even ended. News alerts flooded phones across America as reporters rushed to file stories about the most dramatic congressional hearing in decades. The video clip of Crockett's questioning and Kavanaugh's stammering responses went viral immediately. TikTok users set it to dramatic music. Instagram influencers shared highlights with shock reaction faces, and YouTube channels began posting analysis videos within hours. CNN's breaking news banner read, "Supreme Court Justice admits to corruption evidence," while Fox News tried damage control with Kavanaugh faces unfair ambush in Congress. But even conservative outlets couldn't ignore the power of the bank records and email evidence that Crockett had presented. Legal experts across the political spectrum were forced to confront what they had just witnessed. Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "In 30 years of constitutional law, I have never seen anything like what just happened. The evidence presented today demands immediate investigation." Even conservative legal scholars struggled to defend Kavanaugh's position. Federalist Society member Josh Blackman wrote, "While I disagree with Representative Crockett's political views, the documents she presented raise serious questions that cannot be dismissed as political theater." The American Bar Association, which rarely takes positions on individual cases, issued a statement within hours calling for immediate investigation into any potential violations of judicial ethics codes. The political implications were immediate and massive. Democratic leaders, who had been largely powerless to check the Supreme Court's conservative majority, suddenly had the ammunition they needed to demand real accountability. House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries called an emergency press conference. "What we witnessed today was not politics," he declared. "It was accountability. Representative Crockett did what this institution is supposed to do, hold power accountable to the people." Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced that the Senate would hold its own hearings into Supreme Court ethics, with subpoena power if necessary. Even some Republican lawmakers found themselves in impossible positions. Senator Susan Collins, who had voted to confirm Kavanaugh despite the allegations during his confirmation hearings, issued a carefully worded statement calling the evidence deeply concerning and deserving of thorough investigation. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing marked a transformation from respected congresswoman to national political star. Her Twitter following jumped by 200,000 followers in the first 24 hours. Cable news shows competed to book her for interviews, and political fundraising platforms reported massive donation spikes to her campaign account. More importantly, Crockett had demonstrated something many thought impossible: that Congress could still hold even the most powerful officials accountable when armed with facts, preparation, and courage. In an interview with CNN that evening, Crockett was asked how she had obtained such damaging evidence when other investigators had come up empty. "It's not magic," she replied with a slight smile. "It's work. While others were making speeches about institutional respect, my team was following financial records, reading disclosure forms, and doing the basic investigative work that oversight requires." But how did you know to look for the specific connection? Because when you represent real people who are hurt by these decisions, you learn to ask different questions. You don't just accept that powerful people are acting in good faith. You verify it. In the days following the hearing, Justice Kavanaugh's attempts at damage control only made things worse. A statement released through the Supreme Court's press office claimed that the payment to his wife was unrelated to any pending cases, and that he had acted in complete accordance with judicial ethics. But investigative reporters, energized by Crockett's revelations, began digging deeper. The Washington Post revealed that Heritage Environmental Solutions had hired Ashley Kavanaugh just days after the Supreme Court agreed to hear the Morrison case. The New York Times found email evidence of Heritage executives discussing investment in favorable outcomes shortly before the payment was made. Most damaging of all, ProPublica obtained text messages between Brett and Ashley Kavanaugh discussing the Heritage payment, with Ashley writing, "This should help us finally pay off the boat and maybe take that vacation we've been planning." The text messages proved that Kavanaugh had not only known about the payment, but had discussed using it for personal expenses while simultaneously deliberating on a case that would determine whether Heritage's parent company would save billions of dollars. Legal scholars began discussing scenarios that had never seriously been considered before. Could a Supreme Court justice be impeached for corruption? Could Congress limit the court's jurisdiction in response to ethical violations? Could the court's legitimacy survive if one of its members was shown to be corrupt? Democratic lawmakers introduced articles of impeachment against Kavanaugh, though Republican control of the House made passage unlikely. More significantly, moderate senators from both parties began discussing Supreme Court ethics reform legislation for the first time. Senator Joe Manchin, whose vote was often crucial on divided issues, announced his support for binding ethics rules for Supreme Court justices. "What Representative Crockett exposed is bigger than partisanship," he said. "It's about whether our highest court can be trusted to serve justice rather than their own interests." The scandal didn't just affect Kavanaugh. It cast doubt on the entire Supreme Court's ethical standards. Reporters began investigating the financial arrangement of other justices, leading to revelations about luxury trips, real estate deals, and book contracts that had previously escaped scrutiny. Justice Clarence Thomas, already under fire for his wife's political activities and his own financial arrangements, faced renewed calls for recusal from cases involving his conflict of interest. The court's approval ratings, already at historic lows, plummeted further. A Gallup poll conducted a week after the hearing showed only 31% of Americans trusted the Supreme Court to make decisions based on law rather than politics, the lowest rating in the poll's history. The scandal reverberated beyond American borders. International legal organizations expressed concern about corruption in the U.S. judicial system. The International Bar Association issued a statement noting that the allegations against Kavanaugh will result in immediate removal from office in most democratic countries. European allies privately expressed concerns about the stability of American democratic institutions, while authoritarian leaders used the scandal to deflect criticism of their own judicial systems. As the weeks passed, it became clear that Crockett's hearing had fundamentally changed the relationship between Congress and the Supreme Court. No longer could justices assume that their lifetime tenure made them immune from serious oversight. Congressional investigators, emboldened by Crockett's success, began more aggressive oversight of judicial ethics across the federal court system. The House Judiciary Committee announced plans for a comprehensive investigation into conflicts of interest among federal judges. Law schools began teaching the Crockett hearing as a case study in effective congressional oversight. Young lawyers and political activists cited it as proof that preparation and courage could still triumph over institutional power. For Jasmine Crockett, the success of the Kavanaugh hearing opened new political possibilities. National Democratic leaders began discussing her as a potential candidate for Senate or even higher office. Her ability to hold powerful officials accountable had made her a hero to progressives while earning grudging respect from moderates. But Crockett remained focused on the work. In interviews, she consistently returned to the idea that oversight wasn't about political theater. It was about ensuring that power served the people rather than personal interests. This was never about Brett Kavanaugh personally, she said in a major speech to the National Press Club. This was about proving that in America, no one is above the law, not even Supreme Court justices. The FBI opened a formal investigation into the financial arrangements between the Kavanaugh family and Heritage Environmental Solutions. Congressional investigators subpoenaed bank records, email communications, and phone records spanning several years. Most significantly, other case parties who had appeared before the Supreme Court during Kavanaugh's tenure began coming forward with evidence of similar arrangements. A pattern emerged of corporate interests making payments to justices' family members shortly before major cases. The investigation expanded beyond Kavanaugh to include potential systematic corruption within the federal judiciary, exactly what Crockett had hoped to achieve when she first began preparing for the hearing months earlier. Perhaps the most important long-term impact of the hearing was the new standard established for congressional oversight of the judiciary. No longer could judges hide behind the separation of powers to avoid answering questions about their conduct. The Crockett Standard, as it became known among political observers, required officials to provide direct answers to direct questions, backed by documentary evidence and delivered under oath. It was a return to the basic principle that in a democracy, power must answer to the people. Other members of Congress began adopting Crockett's methods: extensive preparation, documentary evidence, and relentless focus on facts rather than political rhetoric. The era of meaningless political theater in congressional hearings was giving way to serious accountability. 6 months after the hearing, as investigations continued and reform legislation moved through Congress, Jasmine Crockett reflected on what had been accomplished. "People ask me if I'm surprised by how big this became," she said in an interview. "But I'm not surprised that corruption was exposed when someone finally looked for it. I'm not surprised that accountability worked when someone finally demanded it. What surprises me is that it took this long." The hearing had proven something that many Americans had begun to doubt: that their democratic institutions could still function when operated by people committed to truth over power, facts over politics, and justice over personal gain. Brett Kavanaugh remained on the Supreme Court, protected by lifetime tenure even as investigations continued. But his authority was permanently diminished, his decisions forever tainted by questions about his integrity. More importantly, Jasmine Crockett had demonstrated that even the most powerful officials in America could be held accountable by representatives willing to do the hard work of democracy. The marble halls of power were no longer quite as intimidating when filled with people armed with facts, courage, and an unshakable commitment to justice. As this story shows us, preparation and courage can still triumph over institutional arrogance in American democracy. The lesson for all of us is clear. Democracy works when we demand it works, when we hold power accountable, and when we refuse to accept that's just how things are as an answer to corruption and abuse. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about real accountability in American politics. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Congress should have more power to oversee the Supreme Court? And what other officials do you think need this kind of scrutiny? The conversation about accountability is just getting started, and your voice matters in shaping what comes next.